Good morning to everybody. I know that this is an earlier start to these meetings than we normally do, but we do have a special guest today joining us from halfway around the world, and I'll get into that in a moment. I want to start us off by introducing myself. My name is Warren Mabey. I'm the director of the School of Policy Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Contagion Cultures session. I want to acknowledge that I'm currently sitting here at Queen's University, which is on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples. Now, we're virtual, and that means that we have people joining us from all over the place. You may be sitting on many different territories. Please take a moment to acknowledge that it is our privilege to be able to work and to study and to learn on these lands. Today, as I say, we do have a special guest, somebody who's well known to us here at Queen's University. James Miller is currently the Associate Dean in the Department of Interdisciplinary Strategy at Kunshan University in China. Until recently, he was the Director of the Cultural Studies program here at Queen's. And so, James, it's great to see you. And James is going to talk to us a little bit about perspectives around the response to COVID-19 from a Sino-US joint venture university. So we're going to hear a little bit about what's happening in that location and a little bit on James's perspectives. And I'm delighted, James, that you're able to join us today. I know that for you it's late and for us it's early, or vice versa. So James, I want to hand over to you. I'll remind everybody online that we have a few different ways that you can participate. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and you can post questions as we go. There is a chat function at the bottom of your screen. If you move your mouse around, again, you can post questions there. And we have a relatively small group today, so if you like, you can just raise your hand, and we're happy to have you ask James questions directly. But first, we're going to give James a chance to give us a bit of a presentation. So, James, over to you.
Thank you so much, Warren. And can I say what a wonderful opportunity it is to be back at Queen's in a virtual way. And I have very fond memories of my time at Queen's and of the cultural studies program. So, and it's nice to see some old friends and acquaintances. And it's Negroni time in Shanghai, so I hope you don't mind if I will just fortify myself in the middle of our conversation. So about 3 years ago, I left Queen's and began my work at Duke Kunshan University. Duke Kunshan is a joint venture university run by Duke University from the US, and it's in Kunshan, which is a wealthy suburb, if you like, of Shanghai. I'm actually in my apartment in Shanghai right now. And about 2 years ago, we launched our undergraduate program, and we are now in the third year of that. So we have freshmen, sophomores, and juniors. And next year we will have seniors joining us. And about 70% of our students are from China, and about 30% of our students are international. Our faculty is pretty much 50-50 Chinese and international. And we offer something like a traditional American-style liberal arts curriculum, but with certain kinds of interdisciplinary twists. And last year we're in the middle of growing our program, and of course, more or less this time last year, this was when the first news of the SARS-CoV-2 virus first began to spread. I was just about to come back to Toronto for the Spring Festival in China. I was about to come back to Toronto for a week's vacation, and I left China. And within about a week or two, all of the news about the spread of the coronavirus was dominating the news, and the university advised those of us who were abroad not to return to China. And at that point, I and a number of other faculty who were abroad relocated to North Carolina, and we worked from Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. And one of the first things that I did was I was based in the Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke. And one of the first things that I did was to organize what was, in fact, my first ever Zoom meeting on March the 3rd last year, which was a mini conference on the social and political and cultural implications of the coronavirus. And we convened a number of faculty, both in China and also in the US. And I had no idea how Zoom worked or how to run how to run a webinar and how to ask people to press the mute button. But we learned all of that very quickly on a Tuesday morning in Durham, North Carolina. And then as a result of that, we asked the people who participated to write short papers, which have just been published last month by Palgrave in their Pivot series. So it's a small book, about 70 or 80 pages, short articles by faculty and students as well from both campuses. And what I'd like to do is just to give you a brief summary of what I think are some of the highlights of the book, but I really want to leave time to answer any questions you may have in general about my experience in China or about living in China and the Chinese experience of the virus. So the first point that I want to make is really a historical point, which is that China has actually a long history of dealing with plagues and pandemics. And I did some research into traditional Chinese medicine and the history of medicine in China. And actually, things such as epidemics have been long noted within Chinese history. And from about 2,000 years ago, we have the first ideas of things that we might call epidemics today. That is to say, things that occur at certain times of the year where large numbers of people are affected by this. And as traditional Chinese medicine theorists or practitioners began to think about this, one of their ideas was that at the turning point of seasons, so when seasons move from cold to hot or hot to cold, if there are unseasonable events happening, if there are things that are too hot when it's too cold or too cold when it's too hot, this can cause disruptions to occur within the energy systems of the body. And this from very early on was a way of connecting the internal health of people with changes in the external environment. And I think this, for me, has been one of the most interesting things to think about SARS as a consequence, in part, of climate change, as something that has to do with the relationship between human bodies and human medicine and human lives, and broader transformations in the environment that are occurring all around us. And I think that this environmental dimension of the coronavirus is one that I think is being researched quite intensively right now. And there have been many theories about the way in which climate change has produced transformations in the habitats of species, and how this has potentially contributed to the development of zoonotic diseases. And this is something that, in fact, is well theorized in an interesting way in classical Chinese medicine. So that's one of the first things that I became interested in, and it's interesting for me to see this continuation of traditional Chinese thinking in both traditional Chinese medicine approaches to relieving the symptoms of the coronavirus, and also even into the naming of these hospitals that were built in Wuhan. I don't know if you remember, this was kind of widely touted on the Chinese media, that two enormous hospitals were built within about a week each in Wuhan to help accommodate the coronavirus patients. And these hospitals were named after gods, Thunder God Mountain and the Fire God Mountain. And these were allusions to the kind of traditional Chinese mythology and religion. And this was still part of the social imagination of, if you like, health and medicine in contemporary China today. So as a scholar of traditional Chinese religion and culture, these aspects of the continuation of the legacy of traditional Chinese medicine culture was something that have been very interesting to me. But of course, that has not really dominated the news so far as relations, so far as China and politics and so forth are concerned. And of course, the political dimension is one that I guess is most well featured in overseas analyses of the coronavirus. And certainly, one of the essays in our book really focuses on the question of information transparency. And I think that one of the things that we saw in the early response to the coronavirus was, in effect, a lack of transparency in the circulation of information upwards from the local level to the higher political levels in China. People were unwilling to report the virus, and this led, of course, to problems in the initial response of the government to the coronavirus. And then when the message came down from the top that this had to be dealt with seriously, then of course all kinds of policies and activities were mobilized in China to attempt to deal with this. And of course, as we all know, the response of China in terms of saving lives, in terms of managing or controlling the spread of the virus, has largely been successful in a way that it's largely been a failure in many countries in the West. And I think there's a very interesting kind of political and policy way of thinking about this. And from my point of view, this is not so much about the kind of authoritarian nature of Chinese politics. It's actually something that happened very much at the grassroots level, which is that in China, so, I mean, I live in an apartment building. The apartment building is one of 6 apartment buildings in a small community. The community has gates onto the road outside. All access into the apartment buildings where I live is in effect controlled, and this is perfectly normal in China. And each building usually has a kind of neighborhood, or each community, I should say, usually has a kind of neighborhood committee that oversees something like a condo board, if you like, that oversees the management of the local affairs. And these are usually connected to a local Communist Party kind of committee as well. So there is this kind of human resources infrastructure at the grassroots level that really enabled local communities to control the movement inside and outside of apartment complexes in a way that's kind of quite unimaginable for us in Canada. And it's really this grassroots mobilization of neighborhood committees overseeing the movement of people in and out of buildings that really, I think, was instrumental in controlling the spread of the virus. And this was accepted as perfectly normal in China. This is not really something that this is not something that came down from on high as a kind of political directive, but rather was the kind of localized grassroots responses to controlling the flow of people in and around China. So that, I think, is perhaps a fairly, I don't know if it's a fairly unique feature of social organization in China, but I think it's one of the things that was really instrumental in helping to spread the control of, to control the virus. But of course, one consequence of this at a local level is the exacerbated fear of outsiders. And I think this is something that we see not only in Canada, but also in China as well. So in the early stages of the transmission of the virus around China, there was enormous discrimination against people from Hubei province, or especially from Wuhan. And so in the social media in China, we saw the propagation of messages: if you're from Wuhan, go home, don't come near us. We don't Wuhan people, keep away. And so there was enormous social stigma attached to being perceived as someone who comes from Wuhan, and this became a kind of internal geographic discrimination in China. And I think this pattern of discrimination, of course, we see also in the responses of people from other countries towards people from China. And in the small book that we published, for me, one of the most moving essays was written by a Duke University student. She just graduated from Duke this year. She's a Chinese American, and with the development of these kind of disturbing racial discourses in the United States about people from Wuhan or people from China, she writes quite movingly about her being associated with this with this virus, even though she was born in the United States, and but her parents are from Wuhan, and she's kind of deeply conflicted about her own racial identity and the kind of discrimination that gets attached to her as a Chinese-looking U.S. citizen. And I think this aspect of the China virus or the Wuhan virus is something that is not confined only to the experience of the experience of Chinese Americans, but it's something that happens across that has happened across the world. One of the essays in the book is by a young Chinese scholar who responded to the blog. I don't know if you saw it in Verso, written by Alain Badiou, who wrote this, from my point of view, deeply racist critique of Chinese culture. He complains about the so-called filthy wet markets in China and contrasts this with the supposedly enlightened rationality of Western Europe. And I think this is, it's deeply disturbing. So for my colleague who read this essay, it was deeply disturbing for him to think of people who he imagined somehow as being part of the enlightened left in Europe, engaging in this critique of the cultures and epistemologies that have developed outside of the West. And I think that this really pushed him to think about how to develop, how to critique what he sees as being the so-called racial purity of a kind of Western Enlightenment thinking. And he was arguing that, in fact, what this whole experience for him suggested is that we need something like a much more impure kind of epistemology. We need to think about this much. We need to think more about how, or at least we have to overcome this idea that there is a certain kind of enlightenment that derives only from a kind of Western modernity or enlightenment thinking. So there's so I think the idea that Chinese wet markets are somehow hallmarks of some perverse non-Western irrationality, is something that he saw as being, profoundly disturbing. And I think that so this kind of racial, discrimination against China is not simply something that occurs at a kind of unenlightened or uneducated level. It's also something that is replicated at, or is symptomatic perhaps of a much deeper kind of discrimination, philosophically, intellectually, that favors the kind of modern West as the sole arbiter of what ought to be seen as being either scientific or rational or enlightened. So and then another thing that is mentioned in the book, and this is something that you can look at as well, is that we also try to engage our students with in a kind of creative way, and we had students use the ArcGIS story maps software to create story maps about their own experiences of quarantine, whether they were in Wuhan or other parts of, or in other parts of China. And before coming to talk to you today, I went back to look at this this collection of story maps to see the ways in which our students tried to respond creatively to this, and to talk about their experiences of being, in effect, locked in their apartments, and how this changed social discourse in China. And you can go and look at these if you like. There's the website. It's at tinyurl.com/DKU-COVID. tinyurl.com/DKU-COVID. There's about 20 or so of these story map collections that our students put together. So we tried to engage students creatively in that, like, as I'm sure you have done. We had to learn very quickly how to transition our teaching to using Zoom and online and all of those kinds of things. And basically in March, I had to completely retool our first year core course called China in the World into this online version of the course. And that was I, who had never done any online teaching before, suddenly had to learn how to do this, as I'm sure all of you have had to learn how to do this. But this produced this in effect, was something that was a kind of quite useful for Duke University, because we went through this in March and April, and this produced a lot of knowledge and wisdom about what works and what doesn't work, that then Duke University was able to factor into its thinking over the summer, and then was able to, use this to help inform how the rollout of online and hybrid teaching would take place in August and September, when the fall semester started at Duke. So for us, I feel like we've been somehow in the forefront of this situation, and now hopefully we are in the forefront of emerging from this situation. As you may have seen in the newspapers the last day, the economy in China grew by 2.5% over the last year. It's perhaps one of the only countries in the world whose economy actually grew. Whose economy grew last year. When I came back to Shanghai in August, after a rather grueling and bizarre journey via Paris and Seoul, I had to undergo 7 days of quarantine in a hotel, report my temperature twice a day, have 2 COVID tests. Then I was released into my apartment, where I had to promise to stay in my apartment for 7 days and post my temperatures twice a day to the local neighborhood committee. And then they came in and gave me another COVID test. And then after 14 days, they let me out into the wild, so to speak. And then, but on my first day, basically, I walked all over Shanghai, and it was as though life was completely back to normal. Restaurants were open, theaters are open, and classes have taken place on campus. We have basically been operating under a fairly normal regime. The main things that I think differentiate my experience in China lately with what it was in Canada is basically everywhere you go, your temperature is taken. Whether you walk into a shopping mall or into the subway, you either go through a temperature detection sensor, or somebody places a thermometer on your hand or your forehead as you go through these things. And then we have this kind of technological system with health codes. So to go into many buildings, you have to show a health code, and the health code is based partly on where your mobile phone has been in the last 2 weeks. So if it turns out that in the last 2 weeks you've been somewhere that's deemed to be a medium risk place or a high risk place, you won't get a green health code, and you'll be denied entry into wherever you're going. This is actually a less sophisticated surveillance system than it might seem, but it does, because it's just based on where your phone has been, so far as I can tell. But it does at least, I think, give people a certain sense of confidence to go about their daily lives. And of course, the constant checking of temperatures is by no means a sure way of eradicating the spread of the virus, but at least it seems to stand as a kind of useful proxy for in that it prevents people who have fevers, from traveling freely throughout the city. I actually, in October, I went to a theatre show in a nearby city of Hangzhou, and when I was in Hangzhou, I actually became sick, and I felt this cold coming on. Oh my God, what's going to happen to me? And I felt that I had a fever coming on, and I'm pretty sure this wasn't. I had none of the COVID symptoms. It was just like a regular kind of a flu thing. But of course, the problem for me was I wanted to go back home, and to get back home, I had to get on a train, and to get on a train, I had to go through the temperature sensors. And I was kind of really worried that they wouldn't let me on the train, and that I would be whisked off to a hospital and locked up for 2 weeks until they made sure that I was not carrying any kind of symptoms. But fortunately, I made it through the temperature check, got on the train, went home, and then the next day I was like flat out on my bed running a fever, and then the next day it had all gone away. But that experience made me very nervous about traveling, because I didn't want to find myself in the situation where, like, I've gone somewhere, and then suddenly, like, if you get sick, then it becomes impossible to get home because of the very detailed surveillance of at least your body temperature as you travel around China. But on the other side, so long as you kind of stay within your city, as I do in Shanghai, it's been pretty free and open, although pretty much everybody wears masks all the time outside, and it's mandatory in many places. So now in China, of course, there are some more local cases have arisen in the last few weeks. People are worried about the increasing transmission of coronavirus during the winter months, and in about 3 weeks' time, we're preparing for the Spring Festival, where traditionally hundreds of millions of people travel across China to their hometowns. And this is largely being discouraged, but not forbidden right now. And one of the, so, many organizations are saying to their employees, please do not leave where you are to go back to your hometown this spring, and are also there's also a kind of threat side to this, which is that if when you come back to Shanghai or wherever your work is, and there have been some cases of coronavirus in the places where you have been, even though you have not been in any direct contact with these, you will be, made to self-quarantine in your, in your apartment for 2 weeks. So I think this threat of forced solitary confinement, so to speak, within your apartments is having a certain kind of chilling effect, and is generally discouraging many people from traveling internally within China right now. And of course, the other thing that has been largely responsible for the control of the virus, of course, has been very severe restrictions on the foreigners who are able to come back to China. And these restrictions have been gradually increased throughout the year. I was the first foreign faculty person to come back to China in August, and my journey was relatively smooth. But now it's increasingly difficult to get permissions to come back. You have to have negative COVID tests before you fly and after you arrive, and all of those kinds of things. And so there's intense scrutiny of foreigners, who come back to China. And so that has been, one of the main ways of trying to limit the transmission of the virus from outside of China back into China. So I think that from my point of view within the university, I'm not quite sure what your experience has been, but in effect, we've been living with this now pretty much constantly for nine months. And that has, been, our classes have been disrupted, and we have been going online and so forth. The major challenge that we face, that perhaps is different from you, is that our foreign students have not been able so far to obtain permission to come back to China. And so the big challenge for us is that the very nature of our university, which is to be a joint venture university, is a kind of, our kind of raison d'etre, if you like, is kind of vitiated by the refusal of the Chinese government to let foreign students back into China. And that is a major challenge for us. That might be less the case for you at Queen's, though I'm not. I'd be interested to know about your situation. But we have this strange situation now in which we have classes on campus with the Chinese students, but the foreign students have to zoom in from wherever they are. And because our foreign students are, it's been a great challenge for us to find time slots and so forth that work for students who are in Africa and students who are in New Zealand and students who are in Italy. But it's been a very challenging experience, and one that has not got better, I would say, although we've got much better at using the technology and deploying the technology. But the whole educational mission is still deeply challenging for us, precisely because of our nature of, or our claim to be, a kind of global university. So I think that's perhaps many of the kind of basic comments that I want to say. There is one other thing, sorry, that I meant to say on my notes here, which is there's a great essay in the book by Nicole Barnes, who's a professor of the history of medicine in China at Duke, And I think one of the things that she has observed from her study of responses to or about the history of medicine or medical care in China is that, of course, there's a deeply gendered aspect to this, in that the bulk of the care in China is provided by female nurses, where the people who appear in the newspapers are the male doctors, and there is this disproportionate effect that is happening in China in relation to the kind of gendered provision of medical care. And I think she notices that this has not really changed deeply in China over the last 70 years time period that she has been studying how medical care is provided in China. And to that extent, although China has changed enormously over the past 70 years since the communist victory in 1949, in some ways it remains a kind of deeply conservative and patriarchal society, and perhaps even more so in the last few years than it has been previously. And so that may be an aspect of the Chinese experience that might be slightly different. I'm not quite sure in Canada, which perhaps at least seems to me in some ways to be better in the performance of gender equality in the kind of public context, at least compared to China. So those were basically the kinds of remarks that I really wanted to make from my point of view, but I'm very interested to hear your ideas or answer any questions that you may have about this or other aspects of the coronavirus situation in China. Thank you.
So James, thanks so much. This has been really interesting and really fascinating to sort of hear about your day-to-day experiences and what's going on in the communities and how things are being managed. I will say anecdotally that we are starting to see a lot more places taking temperatures here. The one problem they run into is that when it's cold outside, the temperature always reads as good when you're coming in. So they've had to wait for a few minutes while you warm up at the door before they can take the temperatures. I don't know if it's the same where you are. We do have a couple of questions. He had asked where the book could be purchased, and I put a link up to the Palgrave site, actually a couple of links there that you can link on, and it will take you to where the book is. I suspect that it will become more widely available, like through the Queen's Library as time goes on. I don't think it's there yet. The library is not quite as quick these days in terms of picking up new materials, but the links are there and you can follow it through. And I see that James has popped in the Story Map project link as well. He also asked a couple questions. One, as the local community control that you've described has had some benefits in terms of controlling those infections, would the same control in non-pandemic times be a positive or a coercive force in day-to-day life?
No, that's a great question, and I think you're definitely right to suggest that this has been has been deployed as a coercive force at different times in the kind of communist period in China. I would say that my experience of this really comes from living in Shanghai, and Shanghai, to a large extent, is the exception rather than the rule. It's a very liberal city in China. I think that people here would not really stand for much kind of coercive control or surveillance or manipulation of their lives by these neighborhood committees. However, I would say that and that whereas perhaps in the past, in earlier periods of the communist control of China, these neighborhood committees would have had a strong effect. What has basically happened is that this kind of latent power of the neighborhood committees has suddenly been resurrected, and has been mobilized for the purpose of surveilling and monitoring people as they come in and outside of buildings. Do you belong here or not? What are you doing here? When the people come to deliver groceries and so forth, maybe they have to register or so forth. But I would say that in this operates at least in Shanghai, where I live, it operates non-obtrusively. But I think this is definitely probably somewhat exceptional, where I live, because Shanghai is a pretty open, kind of liberal city, and I don't think this is necessarily the case in other parts of China. But I am sure that if there were to be some COVID cases locally in Shanghai, then this would be deployed immediately, and this would cause our community to go into some kind of lockdown. So, but it is a kind of yeah. I don't know. It's like the ultra powerful condo board. I don't quite know how to how to think about that.
It's an interesting thought, and I think a couple of our other questions start to get into this, exploring the long-term implications of what's going on. You had another question about transparency, and that is, to what extent is the government of China's level of transparency trusted in China? Does the general population trust what the government's telling them? I mean, certainly we're seeing in North America, particularly in the US, very low levels of trust in government. What's the situation like at your end?
So I think there's, in general, I find, at least among our students, so I suppose those are the people that I talk to, there is definitely a very serious dose of skepticism, I think, with regards to the specific activities of the government. And I think our young students, presumably probably like young students in Canada, really want to try and take control of their own destinies and try and live their lives in the way that they want to, free from any kind of moralizing or other kinds of pressures from authorities. And in that way, our students perhaps are no different, from Canadian students. What I would say, however, is that there is amongst the students a fairly strong nationalism. I think they've been very deeply schooled in patriotic ways of thinking. They may not be politically deeply aware, but they're also, I think, proud, and they want to be proud of the achievements of China. And in as much as the achievements of China are things that the government can claim credit for, then this produces a kind of an alignment between the government and the people that is essential to its continuing legitimacy. Since we don't have elections in China in the same way, so the legitimacy of the government is based effectively on performance, right? So if it is seen as performing effectively, then this is its basis for legitimacy, and so I think that the government is very concerned to demonstrate that it's performing effectively. And clearly at the beginning of the coronavirus issue, where there was definitely this lack of transparency, this was a potential crisis point for the government. But then, they have managed to turn this into a kind of success story that we in China have, managed to control this. And you only have to look at what is happening in the US to see how that's really. I mean, to me, this is the really desperate thing is that the failure of America to deal with the coronavirus undermines democracy as a viable political organizational system, right? Because the assumption is that the inference is that it's because America is a democratic system that it has been unable to control the coronavirus, which of course isn't true, because in Taiwan and Korea, which are democratic countries, they have been able to deal very effectively with the coronavirus. But I think that for me is one of the deeply troubling larger political implications of what has been going on.
Thank you. Myron makes a point, maybe ask a question here. Is the global pandemic moving us towards sort of a 21st century dystopia? There's been a lot of suffering, there's depression, there are many deaths, a lot of disruption to day-to-day lives, and a real sense that something terrible has happened.
Yes.
I don't know what you might respond there. Any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think I've been talking to professors who study the history of war, and I think one of the things that one of the points that that we've been discussing is the extent to which the experience that this is in effect a kind of like a world war moment, in that lives are deeply disrupted, the traditional ways of commerce, travel, all of these things are disrupted in the way that they're disrupted for people in a wartime. So I'm 52, and I was saying that I felt very grateful that I had never in my life experienced living during a kind of a wartime crisis feeling in which the daily my daily life, my life goals, my aspirations have been deeply thrown off balance by forces beyond my control, and I think this is certainly akin to the experience of people who lived through the Second World War or other periods or other wartime periods in history. So I think that for me this is my kind of wartime moment, and but when I think about it like this, I don't think of it as a dystopia moment, because I think the history of warfare is also that there are conclusions to warfare, and then there are periods of peace that hopefully erupt after the end of these wars. So for me, I think the war analogy is perhaps better or is more hopeful to me in a strange way than the dystopia narrative, which suggests that there isn't a way out of this. So I suppose I prefer to be a hopeful person myself.
Thanks, James. Maybe one last question before we wrap up this morning's session. Do you think that we're seeing trends towards greater transparency and greater sharing of information based on what's happened in China and elsewhere? Or do you think that the trend is going the other way? Because I've heard people talking about both. And I'm really curious as to your perspective.
I think that maybe this is related perhaps to technology and data as well. And so I think that one of the so I think, in my view, it's really the EU that has kind of taken the lead on this with the data protection regulations. America is deeply lagging behind in this regard. China enacted its own data protection laws this year. I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that they are somewhat modeled on the EU laws, and I think that people in China are deeply aware that all of their data is mined. So one of the things that happened, in one of the kind of bad things perhaps that happened, was that in the early stages of the outbreak here, passenger lists of trains and aeroplanes were leaked online so that you could see if someone on the train, if you had been sitting next to someone who had been to Wuhan, and this caused a kind of outcry on the one hand because this was private data, and on the other hand it was seen by people as being a kind of necessary information sharing in order to keep yourself safe. So I think that one of the things that has happened in China is an increasing awareness on the part of the government that it needs to, that I think that the citizens have a legitimate concern for the privacy of their data, and perhaps part of the recent moves against Ant Financial and Alibaba in China have been a concern about the agglomeration of data power in the hands of private enterprises. And I think that has been an issue. That's an issue that I think all governments across the world are dealing with. To what extent should data be private? Should it be transparent? Should it be in the hands of tech giants? Should it be under the control of governments? I think China is trying to figure that out in a reasonable way, just like governments in Canada and elsewhere are trying to figure out this question. And I think that is a kind of shared technological issue that is in some way no different in China than it is from in other places.
Thanks, James. So I'm mindful of time, and I think that we'll wrap up the questions here. I do want to thank James for taking time out of his schedule to join us, particularly given our time difference. I want to thank all of you online for joining us early in the morning. Hopefully you had a chance to have some coffee or some breakfast as we've gone. Coming up next week at 4 p.m. on January 26th at 4 p.m., we have Dr. David McDonald from the Department of Global Development Studies here at Queen's, who is going to talk about public water and COVID-19, dark clouds and silver linings. And then on January 29th, we have a policy talk at noon, 12 p.m. noon. And this is going to have Sam Buttermere, Gerald Evans, Kieran Moore, and David Walker, all who will talk about the response to COVID-19 after 1 year. So the pandemic after 1 year, we'll start to be able to see how things have evolved and where things are going. So I hope you'll join us for those. I hope everybody has a safe and healthy day. And James, thanks again so much. Look forward to seeing you again someday soon. And to everybody else, enjoy the rest of your day. We'll sign off now. Bye now.
Bye-bye.